The day I signed the papers that transferred my bakery chain for $6.2 million, my mother showed up in a dress she'd clearly bought for the occasion. She hugged me in front of the attorney's office like we'd always been close. Like she hadn't told me, 11 years earlier, that I was throwing my life away. Like she hadn't stood in her kitchen and said the words I still hear sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep, "Don't come crying to us when it falls apart." I didn't cry. Not that day, not to her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I was 23 when my husband got sick. We'd only been married 14 months. His name was Elliot. Not the Elliot in any story you've heard before, just a quiet, funny man from Knoxville who fixed HVAC units and made the best chili I'd ever tasted and laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Nashville. I was working double shifts at a breakfast diner on Nolensville Road, and he was picking up overtime wherever he could, and we were exhausted all the time but happy, in the way that young people are happy when they don't yet know how fast things can change. The diagnosis was aggressive, Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 3. The oncologist used words like very treatable and good prognosis, but also words like chemotherapy and minimum 6 months and the cost of the full treatment protocol. Our insurance had a gap, a big one, the kind that looks fine on paper until you actually need it. I called my parents that night from the hospital parking garage, sitting on the concrete with my back against a pillar because my leg wouldn't hold me up anymore. My father answered. I told him what was happening, and there was a long pause, and then he said he'd put my mother on. My mother said she was sorry to hear it. She said they'd pray for us. She said things were tight right now because my younger sister, the one who'd gone to Vanderbilt, the one who'd always gotten the better bedroom and the newer car, and the longer hugs at Christmas, had just gotten engaged and they were helping with the wedding. I said I understood. I didn't understand. I was sitting on a parking garage floor at 10:30 at night, and my husband had cancer, and my parents were budgeting for centerpieces. My mother-in-law called me the next morning before I'd even gotten out of bed. She and my father-in-law were already in the car, she said. They were driving up from Knoxville. She didn't ask if that was okay. She just said, "We're coming, sweetheart. Start a list of what you need." They arrived at noon with a casserole, a folder full of printed information about treatment centers, and a personal check that covered the entire insurance gap. My father-in-law, a retired electrician with calloused hands and reading glasses he kept losing, sat at our kitchen table and went through every line of our finances without a word of judgment. My mother-in-law sat next to me on the couch and held my hand and didn't try to make it better with words. That was who they were. That's who they always were. Elliot went through treatment for 8 months. He was sick in ways I won't describe here because some things stay private. I cut my hours at the diner to take him to appointments, which meant we fell behind on rent, which meant my in-laws quietly made up the difference every month without being asked. My mother-in-law drove up twice a month to cook and clean and take over so I could sleep more than 4 hours. My father-in-law called Elliot every Sunday morning and talked football and absolutely nothing important, because sometimes what a sick person needs most is to feel normal for 20 minutes. My parents visited once. They stayed for 3 hours. My mother cried, which I think was genuine, but she also spent 40 minutes talking about my sister's venue deposit drama, which was less so. Elliot went into remission 11 months after diagnosis. We cried in the oncologist's office. We called his parents first. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's true and because the gap between those 2 phone calls tells you everything you need to know about the next decade. Elliot and I moved to a small town outside of Franklin, Tennessee, 2 years after his remission. His parents had a piece of land there, 8 acres, a farmhouse that needed work, a big metal building out back they'd used for storage. They offered it to us. Just offered it. My father-in-law said, "We'd rather see you build something on it than watch it sit empty." We paid them $1 for the deed because they refused to take more. I had been baking my whole adult life. Not professionally, just constantly. Stress baking, my husband called it. Elliot's remission had lasted, and I was still at the diner, but I was making sourdough at midnight and croissants on my days off and dropping loaves on neighbors' porches because I needed to do something with my hands. My mother-in-law was the one who finally said it out loud. "You know this is what you're supposed to be doing." I opened a small bakery in the metal building first, just weekends. My father-in-law helped me install a second oven and a ventilation system. My mother-in-law drove the first hour every Saturday and Sunday morning to help me serve because I couldn't afford to hire anyone. Elliot handled the books and the social media, which he was remarkably good at for a man who had zero opinions about fonts. Within 8 months, we had a waitlist on weekends. Within 18 months, I signed a lease on a small storefront in Franklin. Within 3 years, I had 3 locations. My parents didn't come to the grand opening of the first storefront. My mother said she had a conflict. My sister didn't come either, though she did send a text that said, "Congrats! Looks cute!" with a cupcake emoji, which I thought was a nice touch given that I didn't sell cupcakes. I was too busy to be hurt. Or maybe I was hurt and too busy to do anything about it, which is its own kind of grace. The bakery was called Tender Proof. Elliot's idea, a bread baking term. By year 5 it had 6 locations across Middle Tennessee. I had 32 employees. I had a wholesale contract with 2 regional grocery chains. I had a James Beard nomination I still don't fully believe happened. We had also by then built a real house on the property outside Franklin. My in-laws had a small cottage on the back of the land that we'd renovated together. New roof, new windows, proper insulation, a porch with a swing. They were getting older. My father-in-law had retired completely. My mother-in-law had a hip replaced. Having them close meant we could help, and they could help. And the kids, we had 2 daughters by then, 4 and 6 years old, had grandparents who showed up. Real grandparents. The kind who remember what they're afraid of and what they love and who show up at school plays even when it's a Tuesday afternoon. My parents had met my daughters 4 times. The buyout offer came from a regional hospitality group out of Atlanta. They'd been watching the brand for 2 years, apparently. The number they put on the table made me sit very still for a long time. $6.2 million. For the business, the locations, the contracts, the IP, the brand. Elliot and I would keep the property outside Franklin. I would stay on as a consultant for 18 months. We spent 6 weeks thinking about it. We talked to an attorney. We talked to a financial advisor. We talked to my in-laws who said whatever we decided was right and meant it. We talked to each other at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed going in circles until we finally arrived at yes. I called my parents to tell them the news. I'm not entirely sure why, old habit, some version of wanting them to be proud that apparently never quite dies. My mother's first response was, "Oh my goodness. So what does that mean for the family?" I said I wasn't sure what she meant. She said, "Well, with that kind of money there were things that needed to be addressed." My sister and her husband had been struggling. My father's back had been bad and he might need surgery. There was the lake house they'd been trying to maintain. I said I had to go. I had a call with the attorney. I sat in my car in the driveway for a while after that. Then I went inside and helped my youngest daughter finish a puzzle and didn't think about it for the rest of the night. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday in October. My attorney's office in Nashville, 9 in the morning. The night before, my mother called to say she and my father would like to come. I said, "To the closing?" She said yes, to show support. She said they'd been thinking a lot and they wanted to be there for this big moment. She also, almost in the same breath, mentioned that my sister and her husband were in a difficult spot with their mortgage, and that maybe given everything, we could sit down together afterward and figure out a plan. I told her I'd see her tomorrow and hung up. I lay in bed that night and thought about the parking garage floor. I thought about the oncologist's office. I thought about my father-in-law at our kitchen table and my mother-in-law holding my hand on the couch. I thought about all the Saturday mornings they drove out before dawn to help me sell bread I didn't know anyone would want to buy. I had already made my decisions. I'd made them weeks ago, actually. I just hadn't told anyone yet. The morning of the closing, I got up at 4:30. I went to the bakery. I made bread. I know that sounds strange, but I've made bread every morning for 15 years, and I wasn't going to stop on this one. I made 3 sourdough loaves and a batch of morning buns, and I left them with my opening manager and I drove to Nashville in the dark. My in-laws arrived at the attorney's office at 8:45. My father-in-law was wearing a blazer over his usual plaid shirt, which I knew had taken some convincing. My mother-in-law had gotten her hair done. They held hands in the waiting room, and my mother-in-law teared up a little when she saw me and she said, "We're so proud of you, sweetheart," and I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. My parents arrived at 9:15, which was after we'd already started. My mother was in a floral dress. My father shook hands with everyone in the room in a way that suggested he felt he was an important part of proceedings. My sister had come, too, which I hadn't expected. She sat down next to my mother and looked around at the conference room with an expression I couldn't quite read. The signing took about 40 minutes. There were a lot of pages. My hand cramped up. At the end, the lead attorney from the Atlanta group shook my hand and said, "It's been a pleasure," and I believed him. My mother was already saying something to my father in a low voice. My sister was looking at her phone. My attorney, a woman named Gwendolyn, who I have trusted completely for 6 years, nodded at me from across the table. That was the signal. I said, "Before everyone goes, I want to say a few things." The room went quiet. I said that this business existed because of a lot of people, but primarily because of two. I said that when Elliot got sick and I didn't know which way was up, his parents drove 4 hours without being asked and wrote a check and held my hand and called every Sunday. I said they gave us the land, the building, the foundation, literally, and that every loaf of bread I ever sold was built on what they gave us. I said I'd been working with Gwendolyn for the past month on a different set of documents. I slid a folder across the table to my father-in-law. He opened it slowly. He put on his reading glasses. He found them on the first try, which is unusual. He read the first page. He didn't speak for a moment. Inside the folder was the deed to a property in Cassius Falls, North Carolina, a 3-bedroom house on 2 acres with a screened porch and a creek running along the back edge of the lot. It was fully paid for. It was theirs. There was also a separate account in both their names with enough in it that neither of them would ever have to worry about anything for the rest of their lives. My mother-in-law made a sound I'd never heard her make before. Not crying exactly. Something past crying. She came around the table and she held me, and neither of us said anything for a long time. My father-in-law took his glasses off and pressed his fingers against his eyes, and my husband put a hand on his shoulder, and they sat like that, the two of them, not saying a word. I looked at my mother when I pulled back from the hug. She was very still. My sister had put her phone down. My father was looking at the folder like he was trying to understand what it contained. My mother said quietly, "That's a wonderful thing to do." She meant it, I think. She also, I could see, was recalibrating in real time. Whatever conversation she'd been planning to have with me over lunch was now a different conversation entirely, because the numbers she'd imagined walking away with were no longer available. I'd already given them away deliberately in a room full of witnesses and a very competent attorney. I said, "I'm glad you were here to see it." That was all I said. Not angry, not triumphant. I just meant it in a particular way. We went to lunch afterward, the full group, at a restaurant in the Gulch. It was a little awkward. My mother asked careful questions about the timeline of the consultant arrangement. My father asked about the grocery chain contracts in a way that suggested he was still searching for an angle. My sister was quiet for most of the meal, and then, near the end, she said, "I didn't know you were this successful." I said, "I know." She was looking at her water glass. I don't know what she was thinking. We've never been the kind of sisters who say what we're thinking. Maybe she was thinking about the cupcake emoji. Maybe she was thinking about all the years she was the one who mattered and I was the one who didn't, and how quietly that had reversed itself. I'm not here to gloat. I want to be clear about that. I have 2 daughters who are watching me figure out how to be a person, and I don't want them to learn that the goal is to make people feel small. But I also don't owe anyone a performance of forgiveness. I don't have to pretend things are different than they are. My parents live their life, I live mine. The distance between us is exactly the size it needs to be. The cashier's house has a fire pit on the back porch, and my in-laws use it almost every evening when the weather allows. My mother-in-law has started painting, watercolors, landscapes, the creek, the tree line in fall. My father-in-law has a truck he's been restoring in the carport, because he always needs something to do with his hands. We drive up 4 or 5 times a year. My daughters run straight to the creek when we arrive, and my father-in-law chases after them in his slow, determined way, and my mother-in-law makes coffee and we sit on the porch, and I feel something I don't have a clean word for. Not happy exactly. Or happy, but bigger than happy. Settled, maybe. Like the foundation finally stopped shifting. Elliot is still in remission, 12 years now. He jokes that he married the right woman and the universe decided to let him keep her, which is the most Elliot thing he's ever said. He still handles the books for the consulting arrangement, because old habits. He still makes chili that I'll never admit is better than mine. I still bake every morning. Not because because it's the first thing I ever did that was purely mine. Before anyone told me what I was worth or wasn't worth. Before my family got it wrong and another family got it exactly right. Some mornings I stand at the counter with flour on my hands and I think about that parking garage floor. I think about how scared I was and how certain I was that the fear meant I was alone. I wasn't alone. I just didn't know yet who was really there.